Shaz has to get behind cover. Oh, come on! There's nothing down. Yeah, but get back up again, Fleta. But there's nothing you can even do about it. Oh, please! Enough! That's not allowed!
Oh, Soul. I've been excited to sink my teeth into this team for a while. The team that was representing the country that housed the esports capital of the world. The team that signed the most decorated group of players in Overwatch history. The team that called themselves the Dynasty before the season had even begun. Somehow ended up with 0 stage playoff qualifications and a pitiful 8th place finish overall, disqualifying them for the playoffs altogether. At the start of this video, I haven't done much research yet. I'm legitimately confused. How did something like this happen to this group of people? Well, in this episode of Sir, we're going to take a look at the Seoul Dynasty season, their highs, lows, and everything in between, to try and figure out how they so massively underperformed their expectations. But first, let's see why the expectations were so high in the first place. The Seoul Dynasty are owned by Gen.G Esports, formerly known as KSV. As the name suggests, KSV was actually an organization created by a collaboration between Korea and Silicon Valley, a region in California and America that is famous for being home to both small startup and global technology companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, Intel, and EA. My point is that Silicon Valley is the technology hotspot of America, if not the world. Now, the interesting thing about Gen.G, which I'm now just going to call Genji because that's easier to say, was that unlike Envy, Misfits, or NRG, they were actually a very new company formed just in 2017. In fact, the Dynasty were the first team to be announced that they would own. Since then, though, they've branched out to League of Legends, PUBG, Hero of the Storm, and Clash Royale. Still, they would have to work hard to keep up with the already established teams. Well, the players that Genji would sign seemed to make that very easy, as the core of this team came from Lunatic High, aka the only team to ever win Apex twice. This was huge. At the time, Lunatic High's players were practically legend. Ryu Jaehong, Toby, Miro, and Zumba were all players that had been with this team through their dominance of the competitive scene beforehand, but the team had some problems with their DPS. Who Are You had not yet met the age requirement to play in the Overwatch League, so he's out. Eska was originally going to start for the team, but ended up leaving to play for Genji's PUBG team instead. This left Guido as the only former DPS player on the roster. Some additions would have to be made, and additions there were. In all, 6 players were added to make the Seoul Dynasty begin the season with 11 players overall. DPS's Fleta from Flash Lux, Munchkin from Laser Kittens, Wakid from LW Red, and Bunny, promoted from Lunatic High 2, along with tanks Kuki from MVP Space and Zephyr from Cloud9. Obviously, the Dynasty thought their support line was fine. These players came from all over the Korean scene, and it was clear that the Dynasty were attempting to form a sort of Korean super team. With a whole host of qualified coaches behind them, it didn't seem like much would be able to stand in their way. And as the season started, that's what it seemed like. The Seoul Dynasty were rolling at the start of the season, starting off with 5 wins in a row, led by Fleta's amazing DPS play. He turned heads early and often with his Pharah, Genji, and Widowmaker, solidifying himself as an early MVP candidate. The biggest issue with the Dynasty at this point was finding the person who would play opposite him in the other DPS slot, which at the time was usually a Tracer main. Munchkin, Wakid, and Bunny all got some playing time, and the Dynasty experimented with different support lines. I mean, they had won 5 straight, so it's not like they were gonna, oh my god, they missed the playoffs. After losing 3 out of their 5 last games, and letting the shock of all teams take them to 5 maps, the Dynasty missed out on the playoffs due to their middling map differential. Okay. Disappointing, but it's fine. They still showed some dominant play in Stage 1, 7-3 is still a great record. They just gotta settle on a starting 6, figure out their playstyle, and they'll be fine. Let's just move on to the next stage and pretend it didn't happen. Alright, there we go, Dynasty. You're back on track and have won 6 games straight to start off the stage. There's no way you could possibly— come on! Again? Seriously? Alright, it's time to face facts. Of the big 3 teams at the time, Seoul, London, and New York, Seoul was the weakest of the 3. They had not yet won a game against either the Spitfire or the Excelsior, and spoiler alert, they never would. Munchkin, who had eventually won out the position of the second DPS slot, was struggling to be the tracer ace that the team desperately needed. Miro began struggling a little bit at main tank, falling from one of the top tanks to the league to being more of a mid-tier. Jaehong and Toby, despite their past accomplishments, were still struggling to perform up to their support standards. In an attempt to aid the last little bit, the Seoul Dynasty announced that they would be adding Gambler to the team. After spending some time at LW Blue, Gambler seemed to be meant to take the mercy reins from Toby, who was better known as a Lucio player at the time. At the same time, this seemed solid departure. Bunny, the backup Tracer player who hadn't seen much playtime, was shipped over to the LA Valiant. Now let's talk about the Dynasty coaching staff. In Stage 2, some concerning issues began to rise. By this time in the season, most teams had developed a certain playstyle. For example, New York was very reactionary, picking and counter-picking based on what the other team threw at them. Houston was a very passive team due to having one of the strongest counter dives in the game. Boston, on the other hand, was built for dive and played very aggressively as a result. Seoul, however, didn't seem to have much of a particular style. They were just kind of there with no particular strategies or goals other than kill the other team. This was eventually dubbed by many to be because of too many cooks in the kitchen. There's so many coaches in the room with different opinions that the team just kind of got confused, didn't really know what to do, simply relying on winning games through mechanical skill like a group of solo-queued players who weren't in voice chat. People would notice, and while mechanical skill was getting them through at the moment, it would continue to haunt Seoul going into the second half of the season. Well, this is great, right? The Overwatch League just expanded the teams in stage playoffs from 3 to 4, so this time the Seoul Dynasty should have no problem— oh, come on, guys! Well, okay. At this point, teams were pretty consistently figuring out Fleta. Seriously, he went from being the sole hard carry to being a non-factor in most games because other teams just knew that countering Fleta was the key to beating the Dynasty. And unfortunately for the Dynasty, it worked. Miro was struggling more and more on main tank until he eventually got pulled for Jaehong, of all people. Sure, maybe you want his shot calling, but really? I mean, you signed Kuki for a reason, didn't you? That experiment only lasted a few weeks before it was exposed that, surprise, Jaehong is not that great at main tank. Shocker. At this point, any mechanical advantage that Seoul had on the other teams had evaporated, and they were consistently getting outplayed strategically against teams that they should beat. But, you know, fine. You know what, fine. But it's okay. They're still pretty comfortably in a season playoff position. They don't even have to do that well in Stage 4. You don't even have to win. Just play decently and you'll make it. Three and seven. 10th place in the stage, only above the Dragons and Mayhem. 3-7 was the Seoul Dynasty's record in Stage 4. What a goddamn disaster, dude. This entire stage, the Dynasty played like their hearts just weren't in it. They were really just a shell of the team that we saw on Stage 1 and 2. Zunba was doing a good job on D.Va, Gambler took full-time Mercy, and he did pretty good. That's kind of it. Seoul never came into their games with a set game plan, they were just lost, confused, soulless, if you will. Despite having a good shot to make the playoffs until the final week of the season, the Dynasty just seemed to want it to be over. I know that's not true, but that's what it looked like. The expectations, the pressure, it all just seemed to get to them, and the Dynasty collapsed. 3-7. So, if you look at it objectively, the Seoul Dynasty didn't actually do that bad. Yes, they stumbled to the finish line and fell out of the season playoff picture, but they showed a lot of top-level play in the first half of the league. Fleta in particular gave them a lot to be excited about. But when you look at where these players came from and the successes they shared in the past, it's hard to not be extremely disappointed by their inability to make the season playoffs, let alone just a stage playoff. For a team representing the country that has won the Overwatch World Cup both times it has occurred, in dominating fashion, it's just sad, and it makes me angry. Korea deserved better. That's why my final grade for the Seoul Dynasty in Season 1 of the Overwatch League is a D. Maybe still axing its entire coaching staff is a step in the right direction. Until next time, guys, don't get tilted. Peace nut.